Have you ever wondered what the dying actually see in those last moments before they go quiet? She was 26, sitting in a hospital chair that had stopped being comfortable hours ago, holding her mother's hand, watching her breathe in that slow, uneven way that nurses don't explain but everyone in the room understands. Her mother's eyes had been closed for almost a day, and then, without warning, they opened. Her mother looked past her, past the IV pole, past the window. She looked at something, someone, and she smiled the way you smile at a person you've missed for a very long time. She started speaking. Names, a place, a colour of light. Her daughter didn't understand most of it. She was too busy holding on, but she remembered every word. And 3 days later, after the funeral, after the silence of a house with one less voice in it, she would find out her mother hadn't been imagining anything at all. This is her story. Her name was Rachel, and the woman dying in that hospital bed was her mother, Linda. For 3 years before that night, Rachel had been the one who showed up, the one who drove 40 minutes each way to sit through chemotherapy appointments, who learned how to read blood test numbers like a second language, who memorized which nurses actually answered questions and which ones just smiled and moved on. Her 2 brothers loved their mother. They called, they visited when they could. But Rachel was the one who was there in the room every single time it mattered. She had always been a practical person, the kind of woman who didn't believe in signs from the universe or messages from beyond. She believed in spreadsheets and appointment reminders and the slow, grinding mechanics of caregiving. If you had asked her before that week whether she thought there was something waiting on the other side of death, she would have shrugged and said she didn't know, and she would have meant it. But practical people are not immune to mystery. They're just less prepared for it. The hospice nurse had warned her, days earlier, using language Rachel didn't fully understand at the time. She used the phrase active dying. She said Linda's breathing would change. She said there might be periods of restlessness and then periods of stillness, and that this was the body's way of letting go in stages. She said something else too, almost in passing, the way nurses sometimes mention things they've seen too many times to find remarkable anymore. She said, sometimes, toward the end, they start talking to people who aren't in the room. Don't be afraid of that. It's normal. It might even be a comfort to you. Rachel had nodded at the time and filed it away as one more strange detail in a week full of strange details. She didn't think much of it. She had no frame of reference for what that would actually look like or what it'd feel like to witness it firsthand with no warning in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday night. The hospital room was small, a single window facing a parking garage, a television mounted on the wall that no one had turned on in days, the smell of antiseptic mixed with something sweeter, the lotion Rachel had been rubbing into her mother's hands every few hours because the skin had started to feel like paper. Linda had been unconscious or close to it for almost 18 hours by that point. Her breathing had slowed into long pauses that made Rachel's own chest tighten every time, waiting to see if the next breath would come. The nurses called this Cheney-Stokes breathing. Rachel had looked it up on her phone in the hallway, needing a name for it, needing something clinical to hold on to. So the fear didn't swallow her whole. She sat in the vinyl recliner beside the bed, the one with the armrest that wouldn't stay up, holding her mother's hand the way she had every night that week. Her phone was nearly dead. She hadn't eaten since lunch. She was running on the kind of exhaustion that stops feeling like tiredness and starts feeling like a separate physical state, almost like being underwater. She wasn't thinking about anything mystical. She was thinking about whether she should call her brothers again, whether she'd missed any messages, whether the casserole her aunt had dropped off that morning was still good in the small refrigerator down the hall. She was thinking about ordinary things because ordinary things are what the mind reaches for when it cannot bear to think about the thing that is actually happening. And that is precisely the moment everything changed. Linda's eyes opened. Not the half-open, unfocused way they had a few times that day when the nurses came in to check vitals and her eyelids fluttered without any real awareness behind them. This was different. This was deliberate. Her eyes opened the way a person's eyes open when they wake up from a deep sleep and remember all at once exactly where they are and what they need to do. Rachel froze. Her grip on her mother's hand tightened without her meaning it to. Linda's gaze moved across the room, not randomly, not the unfocused drift of someone disoriented by medication. It moved with intention, the way your eyes move when you're scanning a crowded room for someone specific, someone you expect to find. And then her eyes settled on a point near the foot of the bed, a point where there was nothing. No nurse, no machine, no visitor, just the blank wall and the curtain that separated the bed from the door. Linda smiled. It wasn't a vague smile, not the loose, drifting expression Rachel had seen on her mother's face during moments of confusion earlier in her illness. This smile had recognition in it. This was the smile you give someone you love when you weren't expecting to see them, and suddenly they're standing right in front of you. Rachel's first instinct was fear. Not fear of her mother, but fear of what this meant, fear that this was the moment, fear that she wasn't ready, even though she had been telling herself for days that she was as ready as anyone could be. "Mum," she said quietly, "Mum, can you hear me?" Linda didn't look at her. Her eyes stayed fixed on that empty point near the foot of the bed. And then she spoke. Her voice was thin, dried out from days without real speech, but the words came clearly enough that Rachel would remember every one of them for the rest of her life. "You came," Linda said. "I didn't think you'd come yet." Rachel looked toward the foot of the bed, toward whatever her mother seemed to be seeing, and saw nothing but the curtain and the wall and the fluorescent light humming faintly overhead. "Mum, who's there? There's no one there." Linda's smile deepened, the kind of smile that comes with a private joke, a knowing that doesn't need to be explained to anyone else in the room. "Joseph," she said. "He looks just like he did at the lake before he got sick." Rachel's chest went cold. Joseph was her mother's younger brother. He had died 11 years earlier of a heart attack at the age of 54, more than a decade before any of this began. Rachel had known her Uncle Joseph as a child, vaguely, mostly through old photographs and her mother's occasional stories. She knew almost nothing about the lake. She didn't know what version of Joseph before he got sick referred to, since, as far as she knew, his death had been sudden, not a long illness. She would learn the answer to that confusion 3 days later, but in that moment all she knew was that her mother, who had not opened her mouth to speak in nearly a full day, who barely had the strength to swallow water from a sponge, was having what appeared to be an entire conversation with a dead man standing at the foot of her hospital bed. "He says it's almost time," Linda murmured, her eyes still fixed on that same empty space. "He says Dad is there too, and the dog, the one from the farm." Rachel didn't know what to do with her hands. She didn't know what to do with her face. She sat there, holding her mother's hand, watching her mother have a reunion with people who had been dead for years, possibly decades, and she felt something she had no name for at the time. It wasn't exactly terror. It wasn't exactly comfort either. It was the sensation of standing at the edge of something much larger than the small hospital room could contain. Rachel grew up in a house where death was something that happened to other families. Not because her family was untouched by loss, no family is, but because her parents had a particular talent for not talking about it. When her grandmother died when she was 9, the explanation she received was brief and final. Grandma went to heaven. There was no further conversation, no questions invited. The subject closed itself the way a door closes when no one wants to walk through it. So when Uncle Joseph died 11 years before this hospital room, Rachel absorbed it the same way. A phone call, a funeral, an uncomfortable lunch afterward where everyone talked about anything except the actual fact of him being gone. She remembered him faintly, a loud laugh, a man who always smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, someone who showed up at Christmas and then disappeared again until the next one. She did not remember a lake. She would learn 3 days later that her mother and Joseph had spent every summer of their childhood at a lake house that belonged to their grandparents. That Joseph, before the heart problems that eventually killed him, had spent years as a healthy, vigorous young man at that same lake, teaching Linda how to swim, how to skip stones, how to sit still long enough to watch a sunset without getting bored. Rachel hadn't known any of that. Her mother had never mentioned the lake, not once, in 26 years. But in that hospital room, watching her mother speak to someone who existed only in her own perception, Rachel had no access to any of that future confirmation. All she had was the present moment, and the present moment was strange beyond anything she had a framework for. "Mum," she whispered, "what does he look like?" Linda's eyes stayed fixed on the same spot. "Young," she said. "He's young again." A pause. Her chest rose and fell, the long gaps between breaths stretching out in a way that made Rachel's whole body tense with anticipation each time. "He's not sick anymore," Linda continued, her voice barely above a breath itself. "He says it doesn't hurt, any of it." Rachel felt tears arrive without warning, the kind that come not from sadness exactly, but from something adjacent to it, a feeling too large and unfamiliar to categorize cleanly. She thought about the years of caregiving, the chemotherapy, the slow erosion of a woman who used to run 6 miles before work and now needed help sitting up in bed. She thought about all the suffering that comes with a long illness, suffering she had personally witnessed in granular, exhausting detail. And here was her mother saying that wherever she was looking, none of that suffering existed anymore. "Is Dad there too?" Rachel asked, surprising herself with the question. Her father had died 4 years earlier, suddenly of a stroke, while reading the newspaper at the kitchen table on an otherwise unremarkable Sunday morning. Linda's face shifted. Something tender crossed it. "He's standing behind Joseph," she said. "He's wearing the blue shirt, the one I always told him made his eyes look nice." Rachel had no memory of a blue shirt that her mother associated with her father's eyes. It wasn't a detail she had ever heard before, not in 26 years of being her parents' daughter. She would find a photograph, weeks later, going through old boxes in her mother's closet. A photograph from some time in the early 1990s. Her father, younger than Rachel had ever known him in person, wearing a pale blue button-down shirt, standing at the edge of a different lake entirely, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. But in the hospital room, none of that had happened yet. In the hospital room, there was only a dying woman describing a blue shirt her daughter had never seen, and a daughter trying to hold on to every word like it might disappear if she blinked. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in hospital rooms after midnight. It isn't true silence. There's always a machine humming somewhere, a cart rattling past in the hallway, a distant intercom calling a name that doesn't belong to anyone in your life. But underneath all of that, there's a stillness that presses down on you, a stillness that makes you intensely aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small fact of being alive in a room where someone else is actively dying. Rachel sat inside that stillness for almost an hour after her mother's conversation with Joseph, and her father seemed to wind down. Linda's eyes had drifted shut again. Her breathing had returned to its slow, laboured rhythm, the long pauses between breaths that the hospice nurse had warned her about. For a while, Rachel believed the moment had passed entirely. She believed she had witnessed something rare and unrepeatable, something she would spend the rest of her life trying to make sense of, but that the conversation itself was over. She was wrong. Just past 2 in the morning, Linda's eyes opened again. This time, there was no smile. There was something else in her expression, not fear exactly, but a kind of intense focus, the look of someone trying very hard to understand a question they've been asked. "What is it, Mom?" Rachel asked, leaning closer. Linda's eyes moved to her daughter's face for the first time all night, really looked at her, saw her in a way that felt different from the earlier moments when her attention had been entirely elsewhere. "They're asking me something," Linda said, her voice clearer than it had been in days. "They want to know if I'm ready." Rachel's throat tightened. "Ready for what, Mom?" "To go with them." The question landed in Rachel's chest like something physical. She had spent 3 years preparing for this moment in theory, reading articles about hospice care, talking to social workers, attending a grief support group her aunt had insisted on, but none of that preparation had equipped her for the experience of her dying mother asking her, essentially, for permission. "Are you scared?" Rachel asked, because it was the only question she could think to ask. Linda was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Rachel wondered if she had drifted off again, if the conversation had ended as abruptly as it had begun. But then she spoke. "No," she said. "I thought I would be. I always thought I would be terrified." Another pause. Her hand, the one Rachel was holding, tightened slightly, the first real strength Rachel had felt in her mother's grip in days. "It's not what we think it is," Linda whispered. "It's not an ending. It's more like remembering something you forgot you knew." Rachel didn't fully understand what that meant. She still doesn't, not entirely, even now. But she has thought about that sentence more times than she could count in the years since. "Tell them I love them," Linda said, her eyes drifting toward that same point at the foot of the bed. "Tell them I'm almost ready." "Mom, I'm right here. You can tell them yourself." Linda smiled faintly. "I know. I'm telling you too." And in that moment, Rachel understood, not with her mind exactly, but with something deeper, something that didn't require full comprehension to be real, that her mother was speaking to two audiences at once. The living daughter holding her hand, and whoever was waiting at the foot of the bed, patient, unhurried, in no rush at all to take her away. Linda died the following morning, just after 7, with Rachel still beside her and a thin grey light coming through the parking garage window. There was no dramatic final scene, no last gasp, no rattling breath, none of the things movies train people to expect from death. There was simply a breath that came, and then a long pause that didn't end the way the other pauses had ended. The nurse came in 20 minutes later, checked for a pulse out of procedure rather than doubt, and confirmed what Rachel already knew. The days that followed moved in the strange, disjointed way that grief moves. There was a funeral to plan, phone calls to make. Her brothers arrived within hours, both of them devastated in their own ways, both of them grateful that Rachel had been the one present, even as they grappled with not having been there themselves. Rachel told them what had happened in the hospital room. She told them carefully, watching their faces for signs of skepticism, bracing herself for the possibility that they would think grief and exhaustion had produced some kind of hallucination in her, or worse, that she was making it up entirely to comfort herself. Her older brother David listened without much reaction. He had always been the family skeptic, the one who rolled his eyes at their mother's occasional mentions of psychics or astrology. Rachel expected him to dismiss it. Instead, he went quiet for a long moment and then said something that surprised her. "Did she say anything about the lake house?" Rachel blinked. "She mentioned a lake. I didn't know what she meant." David nodded slowly. "Mom and Joseph practically grew up there, Grandma and Grandpa's place, up near the Wisconsin border. Mom used to talk about it all the time when we were kids before Joseph died. After that, she basically stopped mentioning it. I think it hurt too much." This was the first piece of confirmation, a detail Rachel had never heard, verified independently by someone who had heard their mother discuss it years before Rachel was old enough to remember. The second piece came 3 days later, during the process of going through Linda's belongings with her brothers, sorting what to keep, what to donate, what to discard. In the back of her mother's bedroom closet, in a shoebox that hadn't been opened in what looked like decades, Rachel found a stack of old photographs, faded color prints from the kind of camera nobody used anymore. Most of them showed a lake, a small, unremarkable lake surrounded by pine trees, a wooden dock extending into water that looked impossibly blue in the old film stock. And in several of the photographs, a young man with dark hair and an easy, confident smile, healthy, vigorous, nothing like the version of Joseph that Rachel remembered from her own brief childhood memories, the version who showed up at Christmas already heavy-set and tired, already carrying the early signs of the heart disease that would eventually kill him. On the back of one photograph in faded pencil, someone had written, "Joseph, summer before he left for the army, best swimmer at the lake, and he knew it." Rachel sat on the floor of her mother's closet for a long time, holding that photograph, feeling the particular vertigo of having a private, unverifiable experience suddenly intersect with physical, tangible proof. Her mother had described a young, healthy Joseph at a lake, a version of him that existed only in a time before Rachel was born, a version preserved in photographs Rachel had never seen, in a closet she had never had reason to search. She hadn't imagined any of it. Whatever had happened in that hospital room, it wasn't simply grief playing tricks on an exhausted mind. The blue shirt took longer to confirm. It wasn't until nearly 2 months after the funeral that Rachel found it, not the shirt itself, which had presumably been donated or discarded decades earlier, but the photograph. She had gone back to her mother's house several times by then, each visit a little less raw than the last, slowly working through the practical business of closing out a life. An aunt on her father's side going through old family albums to assemble a memorial slideshow had unearthed a box Rachel had never seen. Inside it were photographs from her parents' early marriage, before Rachel or her brothers existed, vacations, holidays, a young couple building a life together in the particular optimism of people who don't yet know what the future holds. One photograph stopped Rachel cold. Her father, unmistakably himself despite being decades younger than she had ever known him, stood at the edge of a lake. Not the same lake as Joseph's photographs, she would later confirm, but a different one entirely, somewhere in Michigan, where her parents had vacationed early in their marriage. He was wearing a pale blue button-down shirt, the kind of casual style common in the early 1990s, smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of a man who had no idea he would die of a stroke at a kitchen table some 30 years later. On the back of the photograph, in her mother's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Tom at the Lake, 1991. Told him this shirt brings out his eyes. He didn't believe me." Rachel stood in her aunt's living room holding that photograph, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath her. The particular sensation of having a private moment of grief-induced strangeness suddenly validated by an object that had existed, untouched, for over 30 years. In a box no one had opened. She had not known about this photograph. She had not known about this shirt, or this lake, or this specific memory her mother had carried privately for 3 decades. There was no way she could have unconsciously absorbed this detail and projected it onto her dying mother's final hours. The information simply hadn't been available to her. And yet her mother, in the final hours of her life, speaking to a man who had died 11 years earlier and a husband who had died 4 years earlier, had described exactly this: a blue shirt, and the specific compliment about his eyes that Rachel had never once heard her mother say aloud in 26 years of being her daughter. Rachel has spent considerable time since then trying to find an ordinary explanation. She has read about the phenomenon researchers call deathbed visions or nearing-death awareness, documented across cultures and throughout recorded history, occurring in hospice patients with a frequency that medical professionals have simply learned to expect, even if they cannot fully explain it. She has read theories about oxygen deprivation, about the brain's final chemical processes, about the mind's tendency to produce comforting hallucinations as the body shuts down. She has tried, genuinely, to fit what she witnessed into one of these frameworks, but none of them account for the specific, verifiable details her mother described. None of them explain how a dying brain deprived of oxygen and shutting down its higher functions would spontaneously generate accurate information about a shirt color and a personal compliment that had never been spoken aloud, hidden in a box that hadn't been opened in over 30 years. Rachel doesn't claim to know what she witnessed with certainty. She doesn't tell this story at parties, doesn't bring it up casually with new acquaintances, but to the people she trusts, she says the same thing every time. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just telling you what I saw. And what I saw doesn't fit in any box I've been given to put it in. There is one more detail Rachel has only shared with a handful of people, the kind of detail she still struggles to say out loud because of how it sounds, even though she knows exactly what she experienced. In the final moments before her mother's last breath, somewhere in that thin grey hour just before 7 in the morning, Rachel felt something. Not a sound, not a visual presence, something closer to a shift in air pressure, the kind of sensation you get when someone opens a door in another room and you feel it before you consciously register it. She was still holding her mother's hand. The room was otherwise empty, except for the two of them and the quiet machinery monitoring vitals that had become background noise days earlier. And for the briefest moment, less than a second, Rachel felt something she can only describe as warmth moving through the room. Not heat from a vent or sunlight through the window. Something that felt impossibly like recognition, like being seen by something that was passing through rather than staying. She has never been able to adequately explain this part of the story, not to herself, not to anyone else. She knows how it sounds. She knows that grief and exhaustion can produce sensations that have no objective external cause. She has made peace with the fact that she may never have definitive proof of what that warmth actually was, but she knows what she felt. And in the years since, she has come to believe, cautiously, without dogma, without needing anyone else to agree with her, that her mother wasn't alone in that room during her final hours, that whatever Linda was seeing at the foot of that bed, whoever she was speaking to, it was real in some way that exists outside the categories we normally use to define reality. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow us every day. Stories like Rachel's arrive in my inbox more often than you might expect. Quiet, unembellished accounts from people who witnessed something at the edge of death that they've carried ever since, often telling almost no one. If you have a story like this, one you've never quite known what to do with, I'd genuinely like to hear it, because Rachel's experience raises a question that goes beyond her own family, beyond her own grief. If dying people across cultures, across centuries, across belief systems consistently report the same kind of experience, seeing deceased loved ones, describing details they couldn't have known, expressing a calm that seems disproportionate to what's actually happening to their bodies. What does that consistency actually mean? Researchers who study this phenomenon, people with medical credentials and no particular religious agenda, have documented thousands of similar cases. Hospice workers report it so frequently that many of them stop being surprised by it after the first few years on the job. The nurse who warned Rachel in advance, sometimes they talk to people who aren't in the room, wasn't speculating. She was describing something she had witnessed dozens, possibly hundreds, of times in her career. This isn't a fringe phenomenon experienced by a handful of unusually sensitive people. It's something close to universal, occurring across age, culture, religious background, and medical circumstance. And Rachel's case offers something rarer than most, a living witness. Most deathbed visions are reported second-hand, filtered through the dying person's own words, impossible to verify independently. But Rachel was in the room. She heard the words as they were spoken, and she found the evidence afterward sitting in shoeboxes and old photo albums, confirming details her mother could not possibly have known unless someone had actually told her. What that something is remains the question Rachel has spent years sitting with. She no longer needs an answer. She has simply learned to live alongside the mystery, the way you learn to live alongside a window that looks out onto something vast and only partially visible. Rachel still has the photographs, the one of Joseph at the lake, young and confident decades before illness found him. The one of her father, in the blue shirt, smiling at a camera held by a woman who would spend the next 3 decades loving him, and then 3 more decades remembering him. She keeps them in a drawer in her own bedroom now, not displayed, not hidden either, just present. The way certain truths sit quietly in a life without needing to announce themselves. She thinks about her mother often, not just in grief, though there is still grief, and there likely always will be, but in something closer to wonder. She thinks about what it must have felt like in those final hours to look up and see 2 people you loved and lost, standing exactly where you'd remember them best, not as they were when illness or age had worn them down, as they were before any of that, young, whole, unburdened. She thinks about the word her mother used, not an ending, a remembering. Rachel doesn't know what waits for any of us if anything does. She isn't interested in convincing anyone of a belief system, isn't trying to build a theology out of one impossible night in a hospital room. She holds the experience the way you'd hold something fragile and slightly mysterious, carefully, without needing to fully understand its shape in order to know it's real. What she does know is this: she was there. She heard the words. She found the proof, weeks and months later, in boxes that had sat untouched for decades. And whatever explanation eventually satisfies the rest of us, it has to account for a dying woman accurately describing a shirt color and a private compliment that no living person had ever spoken aloud to her daughter. Maybe that's the closest thing to evidence any of us will get, not certainty, just enough to make the silence feel a little less empty. Rachel sometimes wonders if her mother knew somehow that she would need this, that a practical, skeptical daughter, the kind of person who believes in spreadsheets and appointment reminders, would eventually need something undeniable to hold on to in the years after the funeral. Maybe that's why the details were so specific, not vague comfort, not generic reassurance, a blue shirt, a lake, a name spoken with the particular tenderness reserved for someone deeply missed, small enough to be private, specific enough to be real. If this story moved something in you, I'd ask you to do 3 things before you go. Follow this channel, So you don't miss the next one, share this with 5 people who might need to hear it. You likely know exactly who they are. And leave a comment, an honest one, about what you're carrying tonight. Maybe your own story. Maybe just a question you've never said out loud. Tell me what you'd want to ask if you were given one final conversation with someone you've lost. Some of you already know the answer. You've been carrying it for years, waiting for someone to ask. I'm asking now.